Be more fun.
You know what? A monkey would do a better job.
Hey, I'm trying my best.
Yes, even Kevin would do a better job.
All right, let's get this show going. Recording in 3, 2.
Hi, I'm Karen Garst, and I took a left at the Valley.
I know we shouldn't have to scream that we're atheists. You know, we don't have non-astrologers and all that. But with the religious people taking over the world, I mean, we can either speak up or be pushed into a corner.
I'm proud to be an atheist, a skeptic, a non-believer, an infidel, a heathen. I call it how I see it. I say it's ignorance and you just call it faith and unsubstantiated claims. That's something to be ashamed. I'm an atheist.
Coming at you from still hot BC, this is Left of the Valley. My name is Kevin, and did you know that during the Bronze Age, everyone in an Olympic sport came in third place? Joining me is a team that wonders, why is it sexual harassment when men talk dirty, but it's $3.99 a minute when women do it?
Yeah, right. What
Where are you getting $3.99 a minute? Wait a minute. I've been paying $6.99.
I get a discount. She'd rather be in Europe naked on a yacht destroying her liver, but she's here, Nancy.
Oh, yes I am.
And he philosophizes that life is a sexually transmitted disease and is always fatal. Scott.
Yes, it's true. Prove me wrong.
In her debut, if there's an elephant in the room, it's because she brought it. Annette.
Yep, here I am.
Guys, welcome back.
Well, now that we've all been abused to the first 30 seconds of this show,
That's how the show
the
starts
rest of
every
it should
time.
be interesting.
Awesome.
That's how the show starts every time.
Give me more abuse, Kevin.
Yes.
I'm enjoying it.
No, I get plenty of abuse from all of you. Guys, welcome back. Today we're going to have a great show. We're going to be talking to Veronica Drantz. She's a friend of our friend, Del Rey. Remember Del Rey? And we're going to be talking about assigning gender at birth.
Yeah, I know. I'm really looking forward to it. When you look at her resume, she's a powerhouse, so it should be a great interview.
But first, let's do a lot of chit-chat. We got lots of things to cover. Hurricane Harvey. You guys following that?
No.
This is the hurricane. Apparently it's a Category 3, maybe a Category 4 hurricane. Winds could go up to 250 kilometers an hour. It's supposed to touch down near Corpus Christi in Texas. And the funny thing is, there's a guy there. His name is Pastor Freddie Naranjo. And he just said, just keep praying and believe it will slow down or some miracle will take place.
The power of Christ compels you.
Oh, that'll solve it.
There's always some clown that always thinks he can beat the hurricane. There's always an idiot saying that, I'm such in good shape, I will confront this hurricane.
Let's hope that
that comes under famous last words.
You know what? I have a piece of advice for all these people that do that. It doesn't matter how many sit-ups you do. It's not that the wind is blowing. It's what the wind is blowing. So it doesn't matter how many push-ups you can do when you get hit by a Volkswagen. It doesn't matter.
I used to live in that part of the world, not in Corpus Christi, but further down the Texas coast, near Padre Island and Harlingen. And one of the things that makes hurricanes so devastating in that part of the country is there's nothing to slow them down. It's not like there are trees and forests and things like that. It's flat. And luckily, when I lived down there, we weren't touched by hurricanes, but there was always the threat of one. So
I've been in a Cat 2 hurricane, and I actually drove home from work during a Cat 2 hurricane.
Oh, man.
And Cat 2, what do you mean by Cat 2? You mean a lot of cats?
Category 2.
Oh, okay.
Cats and dogs flying.
Yeah, we actually lost a guy off our crew. He got taken out by a line of trees that came down on top of him on the way home.
Ouch.
So I understand exactly what they're talking about down there.
Yeah, so
having seen it firsthand, and I just hope that everybody gets out of the way and that they're all safe.
As we're recording this right now, they're actually the hurricane is making landfall right now as we're recording. So,
good luck.
In news of the what happened a couple of weeks ago with Charlottesville and all that, and the rise of the neo-Nazis, for lack of a better term, Billy Joel.
Sure.
Well, apparently, he took the stage at Madison Square Garden wearing a yellow Star of David.
Oh.
Now, he's Jewish himself, obviously. And, this is his way of Joel has never been one to be very political, but he thinks it's bad enough that he had to actually wear this.
It's a quiet, not so quiet protest. Yeah,
exactly.
That's a pretty powerful symbol.
Yes, indeed.
I think people in the arts have been almost, I don't know whether they've been leading the charge of protest. I know the Indivisible group has people from all over, but people in the arts have been extremely vocal. As a matter of fact, the council, the Arts Council, resigned because they didn't want to be a part of that administration.
All of them right away, yeah. They totally did. You guys remember Charlie Hebdo?
Yes.
And Charlie Hebdo, as in light of the Barcelona attacks that happened last week, decided to publish a provocative Islam cartoon in response to the attacks. It shows two dead victims in pools of blood being run over by a van with the caption, "Islam, religion of peace." Of course, this goes back to, remember, 2015, in January 2015, where 12 of them were killed by Islamic extremists. So, guts, though. These guys have guts. You got to give them that.
They do have guts.
Yeah.
Wow. I was in Germany when that happened.
Oh, were you?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. That was front page news all over the place, but you were really close.
Very close.
There was a lot of fear that all the other cities would be attacked at the same time.
Yeah, and that fear is justified.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Did you guys watch the eclipse?
Of course.
Couldn't.
You couldn't?
Yeah. Didn't have any goggles.
Oh.
It really didn't do anything up here. I mean, it wasn't like a significant...
It did actually. It was quite impressive. We watched it through welding goggles.
Yeah, so did I.
And what happened was that the moon covered from the right side, and it covered about 80% of it, and then went around and off the left side.
It covered 88%.
Oh, no, I didn't mean that way. I meant in terms of how dark it became.
No, it
didn't.
was weird. It was
like
eerie light
noticeably
outside.
darker.
Yeah.
For a while.
It was like a sunny day, but wearing like really dark filters or something.
Yeah, it was really strange. I made my own. I did the little pinhole.
Did you?
Yeah, I made the pinhole.
How did it work?
Yeah, it was great. I mean, I did the pinhole and then held up a piece of white paper.
Yeah, we saw lots of people doing that.
Yeah. It was just like the glasses.
When you watch it through. The glasses were second. The welding goggles that we had were the best. Or it wasn't welding goggles; it was the face shield.
Yeah, the welding mask.
Yeah, the welding mask. And oh wow, was that ever something?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a certain strength of welding tint you need on those that are masks. It has to be like a 13 plus.
Yeah,
whatever that scale means.
Oh.
So after the eclipse, apparently Google had had a spike in terms like eclipse headache. Eyes hurt. I looked at the sun. Because people are stupid.
What can you say?
Oh, wasn't there a rap artist or something that said, to heck with it, and he went out and defiantly looked at the sun.
Trump did too.
Trump?
Well,
he from the balcony of the White House, he just looks right up.
The rap artist had to cancel several shows because he can't see.
Yeah, it's called solar retinopathy.
He ruined his eyes.
Yeah.
Well, duh.
And at the same time, I couldn't help but laugh because there was a whole bunch of things on social media saying there was a sunlight cross that was formed during the eclipse, which of course is a lie. It's just Christians posting these bullshit posts. I don't know why they keep doing that. Snopes was quick to debunk that right away, but I just don't understand why. What's the point of defending your religion when you have to defend it with a lie like that? It's just ridiculous. And to finish on a lighter note, Nancy, you've probably been there. Paducah, Kentucky.
Sure.
Yeah, of course.
I've been every place.
She's been everywhere.
That's an interesting name.
There's a 52-year-old man, and he told his wife he was going out to drink with the boys. And he goes to a hotel and he orders a prostitute. Now, nobody here in this room is, all very attractive people. I can understand that. This poor guy probably wasn't. So he orders a prostitute with his phone. And who shows up? His 43-year-old wife. She's the prostitute.
Wow.
I mean, it was like a movie. That's like a movie.
That's like a movie. Apparently, they've been married 19 years. Now they're considering divorce. So.
I wonder why.
So.
Of course, she's angry because he's been doing this for quite a while. And apparently,
and he shouldn't be angry?
Well, I have to sympathize with her. At least she's out earning money, and she's out earning money, and he's spending it. just
Wow.
I think it's a financial problem.
I think there's a song.
in
There's
their
a song
marriage.
for that. There's a song for that from
Really?
back in the 70s. Yeah. What was that song where they?
It was sung in Guardians of the Galaxy.
Yes, it was in Guardians of the Galaxy too, where the guy was basically putting an ad in the paper and looking for. Where he answers
He's
an ad
tired
in the
of
paper,
his
looking,
lady.
He's tired of his lady.
That's
and,
That's
and
If you like pina
the answer,
coladas.
pina colada song.
that's right, that's
and his lady ends up being the one that answers him. And
Yeah.
but at least that had an happy
Yeah, it
ending.
had a happy ending.
Well, I think a lot of that goes back to there was a movie in the 30s or early 40s called The Shop Around the Corner, where a nice young man and a lovely young lady work together, and they're single, but they never have a relationship, and one puts an ad in and the other one reads, and it turns out that Jimmy Stewart was in there, and Margaret Sullivan, I think, The Shop Around the Corner.
Jimmy
so that
Stewart.
is that like Sleepless in Seattle?
No, that was with Tom
But this
Hanks.
is the best variation
Tom
on
Hanks
it, though.
and Meg Ryan.
Yeah.
cool.
All right, Nancy, my dear, what do you got for us today?
Well, I thought that because we've been discussing gender for so many shows, and we also have an expert on today, that I would go into gender a little bit rather than any other topic. No, it's not even a quack watch. It's a gender watch.
That's a gender watch. What song do I put for that?
And I tell you why I'm doing it. A couple of shows ago, Scott and I got into a very short but lovely discussion about the fact that we both thought that somewhere in the 70s there was a baby X who had been treated at birth gender neutral. And both of us sat here very confidently thinking, yes, of course, we remember that baby X. Never happened.
Really?
Never happened. But the thing that did happen, that was in the back of our memory, was the fact that in 1972, in Ms. Magazine, which had just come out in 1971, there was a story called X, A Fabulous Child Story by Lois Gould. I think it's Gould, Gould. And that's where you and I both were. Believe it or not, that's where our minds were.
That's where the idea came from.
That's where the idea came from. So I went back.
Hold on a second. Are you saying in a woman's magazine?
Well,
Scott, what have you been reading? Ms. Magazine.
Ms. Magazine.
Why are you reading that magazine, Scott?
Well,
You'll never know.
Actually, men should read Ms. Magazine just along with women. Ms. Magazine was founded back in 1971, I think, by Gloria Steinem and a partner. And of course, Gloria Steinem is one of the leading feminists, and has been and still is. And Ms. Magazine was like a storm on the horizon for women, because practically up until 1971 there was the women's section, and then there was Women's Home Companion and Women's Journal, and most of the publishing magazines treated women as housewives that had nothing better to do than concentrate on everybody else other than themselves. And that's such a bad thing. But women were beginning to emerge because of the 60s and begin to think about careers and their own fulfillment. So the timing was right. So Ms. Magazine was the first one that really covered feminist issues and careers and women as people rather than women as subservient servants in their own home, which sounds harsh, but it was a huge leap. So this story was part of Ms. Magazine a year after it came out. And it is an absolutely lovely story. There's nothing harsh about it. And it's a story that's as relevant today as it was back in 1972. And Lois, this is the only children's story that Lois Gould wrote. She did some books, and she did a movie called Such Good Friends. She was the writer of that. But the story has to do with a baby who was born to the Joneses, and the Joneses agreed to be part of the experiment that the scientists developed to not assign a sex to that child and let the child decide what gender it wanted to be. So they treated the child as an X and dressed it in every type of clothing, every type of toys, every opportunity. And the scientist had written, according to this lovely story, the scientist had a manual that had thousands of pages so the parents could look it up and see, what to do as problems came along. And so this is just one little paragraph about as the Joneses' little X was growing up. And the paragraph goes like this. Meanwhile, the Joneses were worrying about other problems, toys, for instance, and clothes. On his first shopping trip, Mr. Jones told the store clerk, "I need some clothes and toys for my new baby." The clerk smiled and said, "Well now, is it a boy or a girl?" "It's an X," Mr. Jones said, smiling back. But the clerk got all red in the face and said huffily, "In that case, I'm afraid I can't help you, sir." So Mr. Jones wandered helplessly up and down the aisle, trying to find out what X needed. But everything in the store was piled up in sections marked boys or girls. There were boys' pajamas and girls' underwear and boys' fire engines and girls' housekeeping sets. Mr. Jones went home without buying anything for X. That night, he and Mrs. Jones consulted page 2326 of the official instruction manual. "Buy plenty of everything," it said firmly. And it goes on from there, and the child goes finally to school, and the adults have a terrible time, and all the kids love the child. And the story ends sort of...
It's a story. Because
it wouldn't be like that.
The story ends when the teachers decide that the child needs a psychologist to determine, what it is and what the parents are doing, and the psychologist examines the X and comes out crying. And so the adults say, "Aha, we all knew it." And the psychologist says, "I'm crying because this is the least messed up, child I've ever met, the most perfectly, psychologically balanced child that I've ever had." And he hugs the parents and said, "If I have a child, I hope it's an X." So it's a lovely, lovely story, and it you can find it in its entirety on the in the internet. Look under X, A Fabulous Child Story by Lois Gold. So there's the story of Baby
Very
X.
Good.
Now, to end that, there are several families in different countries who are raising their children gender neutral. And we have one in Canada. And the child's name is Storm.
I've heard of Storm.
Storm is now 7 years old. He was born in 2011. 2011. When it was first profiled in 2011, there were two camps, people that thought it was wonderful and people that thought it was terrible. And so far, there really isn't any balance. So you still have people who don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. Storm is actually the youngest of three. All three children are being treated as neutral. They all get determined by vote what they're going to wear, what they're going to do. And they have it a little easier. It's in Toronto, and the school system is actually built so that the children who are being raised gender neutral can be treated with equality and respect. So,
whoa, who would have thought such forward thinking?
Who would have thought? Yeah, but Toronto actually, it turns out, is a good place to have a gender-neutral child. And the oldest child, whose name is Jazz, explains sex and gender this way, and I think it's wonderful. Children know so much more than we do. Sex is what's between your legs, and gender is what you think of yourself as a person.
Very well.
Yes,
Isn't
very well
that
put.
great? Yeah, and I discovered that there is a book called The Gender Book, and anyone who is interested in finding out about transgender or children or how to raise children, it's a 90-page book. It comes free It's an e-book, but costs $30. And anyone who is interested in learning any more about it, it's a wonderful, wonderful book written by some guys in Texas, and it's called The Gender Book, and available on Amazon or download for free.
That's interesting. I don't know how much of a step it is. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but when my daughter was, my ex was pregnant with my daughter and all that, I remember getting some advice saying, do you know the gender of the child and the sex of the child? And we said no. And they said, well, if you don't know and you don't want to know, instead of buying blue for boy or pink for girl, so why don't you buy greens and yellows? They're neutral colors as far as clothing is concerned. All that. That kind of stuck with me.
Good advice.
Yeah, that kind of stuck with me, right? Because it's a color you could probably assign to both. And I don't see how much further of a step it is to remain completely gender neutral in that sense, right? We're already kind of partially there for some people, anyway.
Yeah, I think it's important too with children that when they have interests, to support children in their interests, because if you have a little girl that wants to be a princess one day and wants to take karate the next day, you don't want to say, well, my little princess, you're just too dainty. That's a rough sport for boys.
That's what our society's been doing.
Yeah, you find a karate school that values both boys and girls and treats them equally, so that you don't put any false barriers, to think, oh, I'm a girl, I can't do that. Oh, I'm a boy, I shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
Well, I remember getting a dump truck for my daughter when she was a toddler, and little people with it, Playmobil, really good toys, made in Germany. And what did she do? She grabbed a hold of the people. She wasn't too interested in the dump truck, but she was interested in the people.
Which is something that they that's where I've heard, and I don't know where I've heard it, that is a natural thing, that boys migrate towards one type of toy or one genre of toys, and girls migrate towards the other.
I think there is...
there's outliers. There's outliers. There's girls that want to play with construction equipment, right?
Yeah, there is validity to that. Remember our guest that came on the other, about 3 or 4 shows ago, and he was talking about the actual biological differences in the sexes. And so there are things because there are brain differences, and we probably get into that with our guest today.
I think that's where you said it right, though. Give the child their choice and don't push them one way or the other. Let them choose what they want to do and support it.
But there's so much information out there, and some of it we think is. I mean, the fact that you guys thought that Baby X was a real thing proves it. All right, a lot of people don't realize also that the blue for boys and pink for girls, that used to be the other way around. I think it was in the beginning of the early 1900s those colors were switched. Pink used to be a boy color.
What?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, but people don't realize that.
I was just seeing something where little boys in the early part of the century or the late part of the last century would be dressed in dresses.
Yeah, we were looking at that.
We were watching something, and it was actually, it blew my mind. It was like, excuse me? They would dress them in dresses up until a certain age because it was just easier. It was just easier to deal with anything, right?
Yeah.
So girls and boys all dress the same.
Exactly.
So when did that change?
That's a good question.
I think probably in the early 1900s, because if you think about babies' photographs in your mind, and you see all these women, Victorian women, and they're holding these babies with the white dresses.
Yeah,
those are sometimes those are boys.
Yeah,
but you don't see that.
It's a gender neutral.
1915, perhaps, when the flapper age came in, somewhere in through there, right before there.
History is fascinating in that sense.
Yeah.
Right? I read not too long ago, like for example, braided hair. In ancient Gaul, ancient France, braided hair was a man thing. Women did not braid their hair. Braided long hair, it was a man thing. It was completely a man fashion. So it's pretty amazing to see that kind of stuff.
It's very fluid in some respects, isn't it?
All right.
I think it looks good on both men and women.
There we go.
And we're talking about the hair on your head, not your pubic hair, obviously.
Yeah.
If you can braid your pubic hair, you're doing really well.
All right, let's go to a segment.
I don't want to think about a tangle there.
Painful.
All right, this is another brilliant moment brought to you by religion. Now, we just had the solar eclipse, but did you guys know that according to Vedic astronomy, quote, the most ancient and accurate system of astronomy on the planet?
Really?
Solar eclipses are not caused by the moon coming in front of the sun, as astronomers believe. No. Rather, the moon is described as being further behind the sun, and a dark planet called Rahu comes between the sun and the earth.
Well, we all know
wrong.
that. We know,
wrong.
for heaven's sakes now.
I've suspected it forever.
Of course we did.
Of course, because we've been conditioned to believe as fact that the structure of the universe has been taught to us since childhood, we find it difficult to accept such a thing, but it requires only a little thought to see that actually the modern scientific idea is incompatible with our observation in the timeless Vedic knowledge.
I'd say.
Yeah, okay.
And the Earth is flat, too.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Vedics are the...
And the Earth is also only 6,000 years old.
Well, it's not creationism. The Vedic system is the people that... the Hare Krishnas and all that. That's what they believe in.
Hare Krishna.
Exactly, so... it's always fun. Here's another story that's very interesting as well. Jim Garlow, he runs a Skyline Church in California. The church runs projects such as the Jefferson Gathering, in which preachers come together with Christian politicians to pray for things like getting Satan out of the Capitol, right? While his latest project is a ministry specifically focused on the United Nations. Because what better way to preach to people from all over the world than going to a place where representatives gather? And who's going to head the ministry? Michelle Bachman.
I was waiting for that to drop, but
hold on. This is actually worthy of a different song because it's Michelle Bachman. Let's play this instead. Of course, I don't know a darker, more deceived place on earth than the UN, she said, because as we saw in the Tower of Babel, that's probably the last time we saw all the nations of the earth come together at a moment of deception. Their goal has been from the very beginning the creation of a one world order, but not one under the umbrella of the Holy Spirit. A man's attempt at a one world order that only brings about chaos, confusion, deception, delusion, pain, and that's where rather than cursing the darkness, Skyline Church is about to light a candle. So Michelle Bachman is heading to the UN.
Oh, yay.
Okay, so we're not exactly sure what she will actually do. If she's going to be preaching inside the building or trying to convert people, I don't know.
They're not going to, she's not going to speak to she doesn't have a speaking engagement in front of
that's the only thing she does is speak.
I know, but she hasn't been accepted or invited to speak, has she?
I don't know. I don't know. It's scary either way.
It's scary.
The whole thing hurts my head.
Maybe she's just in a small committee at lunchtime.
One can only hope.
Yeah.
One can only hope. So, anyway... Just when you thought the U.S. could not get any crazier, they're sending Michelle Bachman to the UN.
There is no depth of crazy. There is no bottom to crazy at this point. It's just down the rabbit hole they go.
Bottomless pit.
Yeah.
Better drugs.
All right, so let's go to commercial for now, and then we'll come back with our guest, Veronica Drantz.
Looking forward to that.
All right, Stay with us.
Now it's time for an atheistaudiobooks.com sneak preview.
The Happy Atheist, disproving Christianity after faith, our Constitution, baptized atheists, the God virus.
Here is an excerpt from The Child Catchers, Rescue, Trafficking, and the New Gospel of Adoption by Catherine Joyce.
That's when the pressure turned ugly. The Musics sat her down, Rianne said, and asked her what her plan to parent was. In a letter she wrote later, she listed the arguments the Musics made. That placing your child for adoption was biblical, so God would bless me abundantly for my decision. That I had too much potential to be a single mother, and God had big plans for me. that they had to hold me to what I said when I first moved in, and finally, that it shows you care more for your child when you place them for adoption. Rianne didn't know that consent documents for adoption are not legally binding in Washington state until after birth. Everything was screaming at me to keep my child, Rianne said. Rianne wrote the Butlers' pastor to request that he help mediate some agreement with the family. The social worker called the Butlers and returned to Rianne with a message. They didn't want an open adoption or to send any photos, but they said to tell you, thank you for the gift.
The Child Catchers, now available at atheistaudiobooks.com.
Do you know where Saskatchewan is? Probably not. It's in Canada. If you do, you might know a city named Regina. In Regina, there's a studio. And in that studio, there are, at least once a month, a bunch of skeptical atheist geeks and goofballs who get together to do a podcast. We are the Brainstorm crew, and we're trying to help spread a bit of reason and critical thinking while still having fun. Never taking things too seriously, but still not accepting everything we're told. We go through different topics, exploring them in depth, and often disagreeing. We try to stick to provable facts, and we never trust a myth. That's why we say we're woo-free since 2013. You can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, or Spreaker under Brainstorm, or check out our website, brainstormblog.net. I can't promise you'll always agree with us, but I can promise you'll have fun listening to us.
Take me to church, I worship like a dog at the shrine of your light. I'll tell you my sins and you can sharpen your knife. Offer me that deathless death, the good God, let me give you my life.
So joining us is Veronica Drantz. She earned a Ph.D. in animal physiology and she's taught science medical professional most of her life. She is a former tenured full professor, founder of Chicago's first electro-neural diagnostic technology college degree program. My God, she's got a lot of things. Creative curricula and numerous courses for scientific and medical programs, and very popular public speaker on anatomy and physiology of the medical community. She is at the faculty of a doctoral anesthesia program where she continues to teach physiology and related sciences for the 43rd year, and Dr. Drantz has reviewed the scientific literature accumulated over the last 50 years on intersexuality, sexual orientation, and gender identity. She speaks and writes with the public about her research and its societal ramification, and she is an activist for the LGBTI community. She's a snappy dresser and a snazzy dancer. Dr. Drantz, welcome to the Fraser Valley.
Well, thank you, Kevin.
I'm seeing all these qualifications here. I'm just tempted to just go sit in the corner and eat paste while you just give us all the wonderful stuff that's in your brain. Doctor, there's been a lot of talk lately about this case here in BC. There's a BC parent known as Corey Dotsey. She's a non-binary transgender and she's registered her baby that she called a Cyril with Vital Statistics Agency in BC, right? But she put unknown as the gender of the child. The birth certificate was not issued in June in BC, but the service card, which doubles as a health card, actually came in, and they put you next to the gender for the child. Doctor, is this a trend that this is fairly new in the news, but is this a trend you are seeing all over the place?
Well, I think it is an inkling of the future. Okay. I do.
Mm-hmm. So
personally, I'm going to be 74 in just a very short time. And personally, I think gender is a problem for quite a few people. And I think it's important that, I don't know how much depth you want me to go into, but I think when it comes to the topic of assigning a gender to a newborn, this is a pretty important topic, and people need to understand the very important distinction between sex and gender. That's number one. Mm-hmm. So everybody is clear on that?
Well, maybe we should start by defining that for our audience. Maybe they have a different idea.
Well, guess what? Even defining sex, which is biological, in my opinion, is complicated because, as you probably do know, there are many levels to biological sex. I mean, there was a long time that we knew nothing about chromosomes at all. And it's pretty recent in our history that we appreciate that, most individuals are either XX or XY. So there's that level. Not everybody is, some people are XXY, some people are XO. I even know somebody who's XYXY.
What does that mean? Somebody who's XYXY?
Well, that they have 2 X chromosomes and 2 Y chromosomes in every cell of their body, as opposed to just being XX, or as in most typical females, or XY as in most typical males. But let me just finish answering this question, because it turns out to be very complicated. Even defining sex itself, whether someone is male or female, is very tricky. Because, as I said, there's many levels to it. There's the genes and the chromosomes that they're on. There's the gonads, which for a long time biologists have considered to be the primary sex characteristic. There's the hormones. There's the genitalia, of course, and that's internal genitalia and external genitalia. And now we have the brain itself, especially certain regions of the brain, which there's evidence to indicate some of these regions, very ancient regions that we share with other mammals and perhaps still other animals when it comes to governing our sexual behavior and our sexual sensibility that we've come to call gender identity. And I'm old enough to remember when nobody thought there was any regions of the brain that had anything to do with sexual orientation. They just figured, of course, everybody is heterosexual. Somehow you look in your pants or something, and that's what dictates the feelings that you have for the rest of your life. Anyway, we've had, now I believe there's good evidence to justify including another level in our definition of sex, and that would be the brain itself. And I need to hasten and say that the evidence shows that everybody's brain is some kind of mosaic of gray matter areas, some of which have traits that are more commonly found in females and others more commonly found in males. But I'm talking about very specific regions of the brain, like a very special part of the hypothalamus, which governs our instinctive drives and behaviors. The hypothalamus tells you when you're hungry, when you're sleepy, when you're horny, when you're thirsty, when you're too hot, when you're too cold, and it governs the responses automatically. It's like an ancient, visceral part of your brain that we share with all the other animals. And this hypothalamus, has sexual regions that are hooked up to our emotional part of our brain. It also is very ancient. And I'm not talking about neocortex, where you do your thinking. I'm not talking about rational thought. I'm talking about feelings, emotions, which is what makes you do everything that you do, actually, even when you think you're being rational. So anyhow, what I'm trying to say is there is a sexuality to the brain itself in terms of how an individual feels about themselves. This is not something that you just is the result of thinking. It's a sense of yourself, sort of an animalistic sense of yourself, I believe. So anyway, so there's that. All those levels of sex, and in most people, all those levels sort of go together in a way that we expect them to be aligned. But in some people, they don't, and that's where we can talk about trans people and intersex people. So it's not true that everybody is male or female. And now gender. Gender itself is something quite different. There's no biological basis to gender per se. Gender is a social construction. It varies depending on where you are in the world at the time, you can change your location. And, of course, it changes over the course of time. But gender identity is something else again. Gender identity, I believe, has biological roots, and I would, be happy to share the evidence for that if anybody's interested. But you don't learn it, that's for sure. And the intersex babies who have had who were born with ambiguous genitalia, for example, who've been subjected to these horrific surgeries, to try to attempt to force them into the male or female category when they never will be, and every cell of their body is intersex. People just need to be allowed to be who they are. It is basically the end-all idea that I would share with everyone. As a biologist, that's how I feel about it. But the evidence. So anyway, did I make that clear about sex versus gender? Gender is how you live in the world. Are you a woman or are you a man? Sex, I will use the word male or female or intersex. For gender, I would use the words woman or girl, man or boy. And we only offer two genders, and people should know that, if you're an anthropologist, you know better. And especially before the, Abrahamic religion sort of swept over the planet, there were many, many cultures that had numerous genders. So, for example, indigenous Indonesia had 5 genders.
That's interesting.
And, so I just want to say that gender is something that, is cultural.
So if a child is born with ambiguous genitalia, I totally understand that. But is there any reason to feel that a child whose sex is quite distinct at birth, you have a little boy, but you want to raise that person gender neutral, is there any reason to feel there'd be some psychological trauma for that? Frankly, I think that we are witnessing psychological problems due to gender, due to imposing expectations on children. They're like little sponges, they get these messages very early on. And you're stifling their little imaginations and their ambitions. I remember, again, as I said earlier, I'm 74 now, and I remember as a little girl what it was like and what few options were available to me. And I sensed then that I wasn't going to be your typical woman, just getting married and having babies and being a housewife. I knew that wasn't going to be me. So anyhow, gender, I believe, is a problem. And I think that's what the feminists basically were saying way back when. Stop doing that to female-bodied people and thinking that you can predict how they should behave and what they should like and what they should be good at and so on. So
Earlier,
I think I've answered that question.
Yeah, earlier in our program today, knowing that you were going to be our guest, we had a short segment on Baby X, which was the story in Ms. Magazine in 1972, and I think that was the first story that I remember, that had to do with raising a child exposed to everything, all both genders, and then letting the child choose. And it's a beautiful story, and I think it still holds up today, don't you? Or do you think differently about it?
Yeah. And there's someone I know, Del Volcano, I believe. Del Grace Volcano is a photographer and an intersex person and is a parent living now in Sweden. And there's a video that was recently made. I probably can find it on YouTube. About the children being raised genderless. So I think that that will be the future, where everybody is free to be who they are.
Yeah, we have a family in Toronto that is raising their 3 children genderless as well, and they seem to be very well-adjusted, interesting kids.
Well, and this whole view, this binary view that we have traditionally had here in the Western world of sex and sexuality, that I believe originates from the Adam and Eve story, that goofy story, has done a lot of damage to people who are not mainstream, such as gay people and trans people and intersex people. And what do all these people have in common? that they're not Adams or Eves. Yeah, basically.
You know, Dr. Drantz, people in general like to simplify things. For example, you hear a lot of people will come back with the idea of, well, you know, there's no such thing as a whole bunch of different genders in the animal kingdom.
Well, we don't know that.
Exactly.
As I said earlier, first of all, gender is a social construct, so there's really no equivalent of gender in the animal kingdom. Sex, yes, biological sex, but not gender. Gender is the way the world treats you and the role that you're allowed to fill. When and when think about all the things that we try to do, and you have to check one of those two boxes. And it is usually MF, but what they really mean is man or woman. They really mean how are you living in the world. And those are the only two genders that we give people. So what are people supposed to do when they don't feel clearly one way or the other? And there are people who are non-binary. And I need to, there's a couple of big ideas that I would love to make sure I get into this discussion. Can I tell you what they are?
By all means.
Sure.
All right.
Please do.
Okay, so some of these ideas are really like totally mine, and others I think I'm sharing with most other people who are sort of have their fingers on the pulse of the science of sex and gender. So the first thing I want to say about sex and sexuality is the only thing that's binary about sex and sexuality is the gametes, in the sense that there's only eggs and sperm. I never heard tell of something sort of halfway between the egg and the sperm or some other kind of reproductive cell when it comes to the animal kingdom. All right? That's the only thing I can think of that's binary, because all the evidence that I'm aware of points to everything about our core sexuality being on a spectrum. And the other thing I'd like to say, and this sentence is actually in a chapter that I managed to get into an anthology by John Loftus. If animals had to learn their sexuality, there wouldn't be any animals. So we don't learn our gender identity, which it turns out, yes, we have. You're just not aware of it, unless, of course, it's something other than people would have expected. We don't learn that gender identity, and we don't learn our sexual orientation either. You discover it, and those are givens. Those are as innate as the configuration of your genitalia, which clearly you didn't learn or choose. And so what I would say, if you wanted a synopsis from me about my view on sex and sexuality and the gender that people wind up identifying with, and that would depend on the culture you're born into. I mean, if you were born into Indonesia, and let's say you're what we would call a trans woman, somebody we would have assigned the gender of male at birth, but throughout the course of their life, and usually quite early on, realizes that's not their sensibility, and they would eventually, we hope, live in the world as, according to that sensibility, we would call them a trans woman. Well, in Indonesia, there's actually a gender for that. So the 5 genders, one is what we would call typical male, and another is what we would call a typical female, it's a typical woman, and a third would be like maybe people who are androgynous, intersex people, and people who aren't intersex but still are androgynous, for example. And then another category would be what we call trans women. And the 5th category would be what we would call trans men. So they already have those categories by their own names, of course. And so if you were a child born into the world with, say, male anatomy, but a sensibility of a typical woman, you would learn early on that you are a trans woman, and the world, and that culture would accept you. Am I making myself clear?
Absolutely.
In Samoa,
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
there's a group called, I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, Fa'afa'ini. And again, those folks, we would call them trans women. And they have been socially accepted there for, millennia, for forever. And then now they experience discrimination because of Christianity coming into the culture. In fact, I remember reading an article about.
I would have thought they would be having a hard time because Indonesia is mainly Muslim, Islamic, right?
That's right. Oh yeah. So this area where there was 5 genders. That's very small, tiny, shrinking group. You can still find a video about it on YouTube. But yeah, if you're not clearly male or female, or if you don't, behave the way you're expected to, you are discriminated against in very horrible ways in such a culture. I don't think it matters much whether it's Islam or Christianity. And here in the United States, the medical profession does the damage.
It's interesting because it seems to me from the layman's perspective, it seems the more developed the brain, or the more, for lack of a better term, the more advanced the brain, the more complex the question of sexuality becomes. We see the same kind of complexity in societies of bonobos and chimps and stuff like that.
Well, true, but let me point out, as a biologist with an evolutionary perspective, let me first point out that sex is as ancient as animals themselves.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that's pretty obvious. And even if you're just a clam in the sea squirting out your eggs or your sperm, you don't do it willy-nilly. You do it at a particular time, under particular circumstances, which means that the nervous system, such as it is, in such a mollusk, is coordinating that behavior. And so, the nervous system has been evolving a long time, and yes, it has gotten more complex, but we share the areas of the brain that govern our sexual behavior. We share them with all the other mammals. If I were to show you these areas of the brain under a microscope, you wouldn't know the difference between, human or most other mammals. I'm talking about very ancient areas of the brain.
Is it in your opinion, Doctor, maybe because, like you were saying, the whole binary thing, the only thing we could find is a sperm and egg that's binary? Is it because
Correct.
Science is only, on the scale of time, it's only recently that we've been able to go beyond that, into the chromosomes, into the genes, to discover that...
Well, we've known about intersex people all my lifetime, for at least well over the last 50 years. But they've been hidden. They've been getting erased by the doctors who present the birth of an intersex child rather than a natural event that we should expect in any big population. They characterize such a birth as a social emergency and then use the parental distress that they caused as the reason for doing this irreversible, life-altering surgery that very often is very damaging, cutting away nerve endings, and all for the sake of cosmetics and trying to force these babies into the male or the female category, when in fact they are neither.
Wasn't there a very famous and horrible case of twins
Yes.
some time back? And
David Reimer.
Yes, exactly.
Reimer.
And it was what the doctor's name was, like Dr. Money. Yeah, Dr. Money.
Yes, John Money.
Yeah,
and
he was
his
a psychologist.
adversary.
Yeah, it was just.
John Money was a psychologist.
That's right.
And Milton Diamond was his adversary. Milton Diamond was a physiologist like me.
Uh-huh.
But a biologist with an evolutionary point of view. So Milton Diamond was a proponent of the sexuality at birth theory. That your brain is already organized by via genes and hormones. The brain is already organized in terms of what your sexuality is going to be like when you grow up. Okay? You're going to go through puberty, of course, and that's going to be the activation time when this behavior emerges. But the brain is already organized just the way your genitalia are already organized at birth. Okay? Now, that's the physiologist's perspective. Basically, I'm simplifying, but that's basically it. John Money, his theory was the official name was that you learned. His theory was that you learned your sexuality, that you're born pretty much with a blank brain.
And we know how that turned out.
And David Reimer was John Money's most famous patient.
Yeah.
David Reimer was referred to in the medical literature as the John Joan case. Except David Reimer, had no idea that this was that he was in the medical literature at all. Was raised as a little girl, lied to, etc. The same way intersex people are treated. Only to discover as a young teen that he was actually born a boy, because he was a miserable little girl, miserable. And as soon as he became aware that he was actually born a boy, then acted on that. And underwent whatever hormonal treatments and surgeries were available for him to transition. He wound up anyway. It's a tragic story.
It was. I remember. I think didn't he and his twin brother end up committing suicide because their lives
we don't know if they might have, if that might have happened anyway.
Yeah.
But and Milton Diamond was very sad about that. So what happened was, over the many years, here's poor David Reimer being raised as this girl, miserable girl, and John Money getting famous off of this case, and this was the justification for the surgeons to go mutilate the ambiguous genitalia of newborn intersex babies, and also to do all sorts of surgeries on other kinds of intersex people whose outer anatomy might have looked relatively normal, but like female genitalia, but they actually have testes because they have complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, for example. Anyway, all these surgical procedures, which are still happening even though they're horrific and they do damage, all of this is designed to deny the existence of intersex people and try to force them to look like conventional males or females, whatever that's supposed to mean. So it's a sad story that this is still continuing because so many of them are raised in the gender that does not conform to their sensibility, and they wind up later in life, very often, transitioning and experiencing much the same kind of problems that trans people experience. And trans people are the proof, actually, that we have a gender identity, and look what they go through in order to live according to their sensibility. So if I could take a little bit more time and tell you, I'm going to ask you to construct a three-dimensional graph in your mind.
Okay.
And this three-dimensional space, of course, has an infinity of points in it. And I would insist that there's somebody at every single one of those points in this space, even though many of the points could be clustered. All right, so this is a three-dimensional graph. So we're going to have an x-axis running from left to right. And a y-axis going up and down, and a z-axis at right angles to that, giving us depth in our graph.
Yes.
So on the first axis, the x-axis, on the one extreme is the typical female anatomy and physiology, and on the other extreme is the typical male anatomy and physiology, and we have a spectrum on that x-axis. Now, this is even an oversimplification because there are many levels to intersex. But what I'm saying is that there are people at every point along that line between what we think of as regular females and regular males. And so if you were right in the very smack dab in the middle of that line, you would be as intersex as you could get. And you're neither clearly male nor female. You're just sort of right there in between. And there are people like that with genitalia exactly right in the middle, so to speak, because, of course, our external genitalia come from exactly the same structures early on that start out looking much the same in everyone. So there you have a spectrum when it comes to physical and physiological sex. Okay, now the second axis is the y-axis running up and down. And let's say at the upper end, and this is your axis for gender identity. So at the upper end would be a female identity, where you feel about yourself, and at the other end would be the male identity. So we now have a planar graph with 4 quadrants in it. Mm-hmm. But now I'm going to slice those 4 quadrants in half by introducing another axis, the z-axis. It's going to run depth-wise through that plane of the x and y-axis. And this z-axis would be the sexual orientation. So we wind up with 8 quadrants, 4 in front, 4 in back, along that z-axis, and everybody's in their own point somewhere in this 3-dimensional graph, because all 3 of those things about I would like to say that core sexuality has 3 aspects to it: the physical anatomical aspect to it, and the other 2 are the brain things. How do you feel about yourself? What is your gender identity? And the sexual orientation. How do you feel about other folks? Who do you fall in love with, so to speak? Those are core aspects of anyone's sexuality, and nobody learns them. They're a given. They're innate.
Interesting. So, Doctor, given all this new information and given the state of the world as it is, how do you think we should implement this in our society? And do you feel positive about the future of this in light of maybe the current administration you guys have in the States?
Oh, please. 1 step forward, 2 steps back,
Yeah, we're seeing that day by day, unfortunately, aren't we?
Yes. And I think it's the last gasp of the straight white man trying to control everything in the world. Just like 9/11 was the last gasp of faith trying to control people versus the empirical method of science. So I have faith, though, that logic and science and people's good nature will prevail. We are the moral animals, We do want to do the right thing by each other. It's in our nature to be that way. So I'm optimistic. And here we have a little candle burning in the darkness, somebody who's very different themselves and is insisting that their child be raised in a genderless way. Why are people afraid of that? If they're so convinced that, gender is, if they think that gender is biological, then it will emerge, won't it? It will happen. And so what are you afraid of? I don't understand.
Where do you think the fear comes from? Do you think it's religious, or is there something else going on?
Everything in our culture is based on this Adam and Eve kind of idea, that everybody's either man or a woman, and that all men are males, and that all women are females, and then it gets even worse because then the thinking becomes like everybody in the male group, which lives in the world as men, they all kind of have to be kind of sort of alike, in manly ways. And then this other group is supposed to be the opposite. Instead of just different, somehow it becomes opposite. And all these female-bodied people should be living in the world as women, and putting gender on that, restricting them. And look at the Bible. I mean, how does it start out? All the Abrahamic religions with using religion to justify injustice. We start out with the Adam and Eve story to justify misogyny. Eve is just an afterthought, comes from a rib of Adam, da-da-da-da. And from this, look at all the damage that's been done through this kind of binary thinking.
Yeah.
You know what? We've known Biology 101. Everybody knows that we're all unique.
Yep.
Everybody knows that the products of sexual reproduction are always unique offspring, with the rare exceptions of identical twins. And even they're different when you look at epigenetics, etc.
Fantastic.
And so, biology, as a physiologist, I would just like to say that there's a mechanism. There's a mechanism for sexual development, and that this sexual development includes the brain. And this mechanism, which is often called the organization activation mechanism, is the same mechanism in everyone. Exactly the same mechanism, but we get a unique outcome with every person. How is that possible? Well, this is how nature works. We tweak the genes, which is the first part of the sexual development story, exclusively, and then hormones dominate much of the second part of the sexual development story in utero. But even hormones have genetic underpinnings. But we can tweak the timing and the levels and the thresholds for the hormones. And so what we wind up with in every single person is something unique when it comes to sexuality. Something that Kinsey sort of hit on early on. I mean, I would say that's the most important thing he found. We could argue about details, but what he discovered is that there's so much diversity to sexuality. And I would insist that, as I said now, there's diversity along a spectrum for every aspect of core sexuality. Your physical sex, your gender identity, and your sexual orientation.
Perfect.
And so everybody's unique. We need to let people be. Let people be who they are. In fact, I would insist that the most basic human right there is the right to be who you are.
And that is a fantastic way to end this interview. Dr. Drantz, thank you so much for joining us today. If people want to find out more about you, where can they reach you?
I'd be glad to give my email address, if that's okay.
That's okay. If it's okay with you, go for it.
Dr. Drantz, DRDRANTZ, at sbcglobal.net.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
Dr. Drantz.
I also have a website. It's kind of, I just post videos and things when I do presentations. Probably I'll put this podcast on there, which people can find if they Google me.
Perfect. Plug it in. By all means. You have the name of the website?
Dr. Drantz-sciencesexuality.blogspot.com.
Perfect. Excellent. Dr. Drantz, before I let you go, can I get you to say, "Hi, I'm Dr. Drantz, and I took a left at the Valley."
Hi, I'm Dr. Drantz, and I took a left at the Valley.
And that was Dr. Veronica Drantz. Wow, what a fountain of knowledge, this woman.
Oh, man, oh, man, oh, man.
That was absolutely awesome.
Let everybody be who they are, and the complication is getting others to accept that point of view.
It makes total sense, too, right? Because after all, I mean, everybody likes to think they're unique, so why wouldn't your sexuality be unique, too?
Well, we are all unique.
We have unique fingerprints, we have unique everything. Your mind is unique.
That's just nature.
Exactly.
We're not machines. We're not stamped out on an assembly line. We're we're subject to the whims of nature. How we develop everything is fluid.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you think about the spectrum, and let's think about a man who finds another man attractive, or finds himself drawn to that particular man, and suddenly there's a fear. Oh my God, am I homosexual? It's not that. Isn't this wonderful? I find this individual attractive, and that's part of my spectrum of being a human being. But immediately, is there guilt? Is there the culture forces us to fear that kind of emotion?
Yeah. So that's a problem I have, because I can never find a purse that matches my shoes. But otherwise, that's my issue. Thank you so much for joining.
You're just shopping at the wrong stores.
Maybe I am.
I'll go with you, Kevin.
Oh, maybe that's what we need, a shopping trip. Thank you so much for joining us on the show, guys, today. Oh, and by the way, I want to wish a happy birthday to Daryl Ray. It was his birthday.
Oh, happy birthday, Daryl.
I believe it was actually Dr. Ray, which will be on the show very soon. Coming up, we have, next week, we have our old friend Jonathan Baker coming back to talk about the Paris Accord. The week after that, that's when we have our friend Del Ray. We talk about recovering from religion. On the 16th, we'll have Michael Sparks will be talking to us about how Canadians felt about Bernie Sanders. At the end of the month, we have our old friend Arn Raw. His rawness comes back to amaze us as usual.
I know. I can't wait for his take on what's happening politically in the States.
Exactly. And at the end of the month, we'll have the legendary Jerry Coyne. I'm just going to keep it there for now.
Yeah. We've just got too much goodness to share all at once. We can parcel it out and tease.
You can find us at leftofthevalley.com. You can send us an email at leftofthelvalley@outlook.com. You can send your complaints to Nancy at
Third floor.
Third floor. You can find us on Facebook, on Twitter, at LETV Podcast. If you like the show, you like the idea that it's easy and you want to share our show, just give us a 5-star review on iTunes. We'd appreciate that. Anything else we need to say? Christina's not here to say read Harry Potter, so we don't have to tell her.
No,
come on, now I miss her because you said that.
No, I can't wait till next week. We can do it all over again.
Exactly. Guys, thank you so much. Until next time.
This is how your God made me. Skeptical of anything that contradicts history, denies evolution, hates science, promotes mystery. I'd rather see the truth than to bask in my own ignorance. Rather be alone than surrounded by damn idiots. As long as there's a breath in my body, you can bet your last dollar I'll be working hard fighting this problem. Religion is a disease, it comes from culture, only true on a regional scale. Science is universal. For you to say that Horus isn't real, but Jesus is, or Zeus, Thor, Mithra, Vishnu, you don't believe in them. I think the reason is apparent. You do what you're told and believe in the God assigned by your parents. I'm proud to be an atheist, a skeptic, a non-believer, an infidel, a heathen. I call it how I see it. I say it's ignorance and you just call it faith and unsubstantiated claims. That's something to be ashamed. I'm an atheist. Atheist. I'm an atheist. Atheist. I'm an atheist. I'm an atheist. Now let me take a sec. Don't mean to sound so hateful, but I swear to God, pun intended, I find it disgraceful that thousands of children are raped by priests, and since they're holy men of God, they get away scot-free. And the Pope does his very best to keep it on the hush. Don't wanna affect business, he loves money too much. We know that they love the kids, but how the fuck can we protect them while they planning to molest them? We teaching them to respect them.
Fuck that.
The system is broke down, working backwards, and the only action or tactic I plan to practice now is to attack them. The parties of God's hands are bloodstained, millions of murders by believers, and they're all in God's name. And let me take a sec, don't mean to sound so hateful, but I swear to God, pun intended, I find it disgraceful that many atheists are told to be quiet. You're not alone, speak your mind, time to let it be known. I'm proud to be an atheist, a skeptic, a non-believer, an infidel, a heathen. I call it how I see it. I say it's ignorance and you just call it faith and unsubstantiated unsubstantiated claims. That's something to be ashamed. I'm an atheist. I'm